The rain had not yet fallen on Denver that April morning in 1876, but the sky carried the weight of it. Clara Whitfield stood behind her father in the second-floor office of Gerald Harrington, and she noticed before she noticed anything else that the room smelled of cedar oil and fresh ink. Not old ink, fresh ink, that was the first thing. The office was immaculate in the way that only deliberate men keep their spaces immaculate. Books arranged by height, papers squared at perfect corners, a painting of mountain elk above the fireplace, positioned so that visitors sitting across the desk would see it over Harrington's shoulder and be reminded without being told directly of the kind of man they were dealing with. A man who owned things, a man who belonged to this landscape in ways that others did not. Gerald Harrington himself sat behind the wide mahogany desk with the patience of someone who had already won and was merely waiting for the other party to understand it. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a gray wool vest that cost more than Clara's father earned in a month. His hands were folded on the desk. His expression was the expression of a physician delivering difficult news, sympathetic and practiced and entirely without warmth. Arthur Whitfield sat across from him. Clara's father was a good man. She had always believed that, and she believed it still standing behind him in that cedar-scented room. But goodness and strength are not the same thing, and Arthur Whitfield had been without strength for 3 years now, ever since the woman who had given him both left the world on a cold February morning and took everything with her except the debts. Harrington pushed a folder of documents across the desk. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I want nothing more than to resolve this situation to everyone's benefit. You borrowed against future inventory 4 years ago. The interest has accumulated. The principal remains. I have been patient, as I believe you know." Arthur reached for the documents with hands that trembled slightly. Not from age, from shame. Clara looked at the papers from where she stood. She was not supposed to be here. She had insisted on coming, and her father had not had the energy to refuse her. Now she looked at the documents the way her Uncle Henry had taught her to look at documents, starting not with the words, but with the physical evidence of the words. The paper, the ink, the formatting. The body of the contract was written in deep blue ink, the color of something that had oxidized over years. That was consistent. That was expected for a document 4 years old. But the signature line and the date column at the bottom of page 1 carried a slightly different shade. Not dramatically different. The kind of difference that would mean nothing to a man signing in a hurry, trusting in the legitimacy of a leather-bound office and a silver-haired smile. But Clara had spent 6 years learning to see exactly this kind of difference. The ink at the bottom was newer, diluted to approximate age, and the numeral 3 in the figure $3,200 had been written with a different pen pressure than the digits surrounding it, slightly sharper at the curve of the hand of someone writing quickly to replace what had been there before. Uncle Henry had taught her that when she was 15 years old, sitting at his kitchen table in the lamplight with a practice ledger between them. He had been a bank auditor for 20 years before he refused to sign a report and walked away from the profession with nothing but his tools and his principles. He had given both to Clara in the years before his death. The tools were in a wooden box under her bed at home. The principles were in her chest, quiet and certain as a heartbeat. Those numbers are wrong, she thought. That contract has been altered. Before she could speak, Harrington leaned forward slightly, and his voice shifted to the register of a man extending a kindness. "I have a proposal," he said. "There are 3 brothers in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory. The Callaway family, good men established as ranchers. The eldest has need of a wife to manage the household keep. Accounts bring some order to a large operation. If your daughter were willing to travel north and enter into that arrangement, I would be prepared to forgive this debt entirely, every cent." Arthur Whitfield looked at the documents in his hands. Then he looked at his daughter. Clara did not look at her father. She looked at Gerald Harrington. And Harrington, with the confidence of a man accustomed to being underestimated by people who were about to do what he wanted, looked back at her with an expression that was almost kind. He was not afraid of what she knew. That much was clear. He did not know she had seen the ink. And even if he had suspected, it would not have concerned him, because a 20-year-old girl from a failing shop in Denver was not the kind of person whose observations changed the outcome of anything. That was his first mistake. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I see." 2 words. Her father heard capitulation in them. Harrington heard the same. Clara heard something else entirely, the sound of a decision being made. She would go, but she would not go the way they imagined. That night in the small bedroom above the shop that smelled of dried goods and lamp oil, Clara sat at her writing desk with the wooden box open beside her, Uncle Henry's tools, a fine-tipped accounting pen, a set of calibrated rulers, a magnifying glass with a brass handle worn smooth from years of use, and a leather-bound notebook with his initials pressed into the cover. H.W. Henry Whitfield. She had not opened it since the week after his funeral. She opened it now. On the first clean page, she began to write from memory. The color of the ink and the contract's signature line. The pen pressure differential in the numeral 3. The formatting inconsistencies in the date column. The fact that a loan of that size taken against future inventory of a small general store would have required a cosigner under standard banking practice, and no cosigner had been listed. She wrote it all down precise and ordered the way Henry had always insisted. Not because it felt good to write it, because a thing written down exists in the world in a way that a thing merely remembered does not. Evidence needs a body. She was giving it one. She did not know yet what she would do with these notes. She did not know what was waiting for her in Montana, or what kind of man Eli Calloway was, or why Gerald Harrington wanted her inside that household badly enough to manufacture a reason. But she knew this: she would keep her eyes open. She would keep counting. And when she found what she was looking for, she would know it by the ink. She closed the notebook, placed it at the bottom of the wooden box, and locked the clasp. Then she went to sleep, because a clear head on the morning of a journey was worth more than a night spent in worry. 3 days on the stage north. The roads turned from the flat certainty of Denver to the rolling uncertainty of the high country, and the world outside the coach window grew wilder and colder and more magnificent in the way that wild things always are, uncomfortable and undeniable at once. Clara watched it all. She watched the other passengers too, a habit she could not turn off, noting the way a man's hands told his history, the way a woman's eyes moved when she was listening to something she did not quite believe. She did not share her story with anyone. She was not the sharing kind. The stage put her down in Sterling Creek, Montana territory in the last hour of gray afternoon light, and a lean, weathered man with a mailbag over one shoulder met her at the stop and told her he would drive her out to the Calloway place. He seemed a decent sort. He also seemed like someone who spent a good portion of his days carrying information from one part of this valley to another, which was the kind of man worth listening to carefully. The Calloway brothers, he offered as they moved away from the last buildings of town and into the open country. They're good men, not what you'd call easy men, but good ones. He paused the way people pause when they are about to say the part they have been deciding whether to say. The eldest especially. He doesn't give much away, but he's fair as anyone I've met out here, and I've met most everyone. How many brothers? Claire asked. 3. He said it simply as if this were a well-known fact that needed no elaboration. 3. Claire absorbed this. She had been told she was coming to be a bride for the eldest brother. She had not been told about the full scope of the household. 3 men. 3 sets of eyes and habits and histories she did not know. 3 people whose trust she would need to earn if she was going to accomplish anything at all. The wagon rolled on through the fading light, the mountains closing in on both sides of the valley floor, dark and permanent and utterly indifferent to the small human concerns moving beneath them. Then a rise in the road, and below and ahead, a light in a window, yellow and warm against the coming dark. And on the porch of the house that held that light, 3 figures standing. Clara descended from the wagon and looked up at them. The porch lantern was behind them, which meant she saw their shapes before she saw their faces. 3 silhouettes of considerable size. The kind of men who spent their lives in physical work and carried it in the width of their shoulders, in the steadiness of their standing. She could not yet see their expressions. She could feel their assessment. She kept her chin level, her hands at her sides. She had been raised to keep her chin level, and if there was one thing she was grateful to her father for, it was that. The tallest figure stepped down from the porch. He came into the lamplight as he descended, and Clara saw him clearly: Eli Calloway. 33 years old, though he could have passed for older, not in the sense of weakness, but in the sense of accumulated weight. The kind of man who had been responsible for things from a very young age and had never fully shed the habit. He was tall in a way that made other men recalibrate themselves unconsciously when he entered a room. His eyes were the color of late whiskey and firelight, and they were studying her the way a man studies something he is considering the trusting, which meant he was not trusting her yet. He did not offer a greeting immediately. He looked at her the way he had probably looked at every significant decision in his life, directly without apology for exactly as long as he needed. "You are Clara Whitfield," he said. "Not a question." "I am," she said. "And you are Eli Calloway." Also not a question. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. An adjustment, perhaps. He had not expected that. She noted it. The second brother came forward with an energy entirely unlike the first. Seth Calloway was 28 and wore his warmth the way some men wear a good hat naturally and without self-consciousness. He had his brother's broad shoulders but a different quality in the eyes, something open and immediate. The eyes of a man who genuinely liked most people and had not yet been sufficiently burned to reconsider this policy. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his handshake was warm and direct. "Welcome to Ironwood Ranch. Are you hungry? It's a long ride from town. Agnes has kept supper. We weren't sure when you'd arrive, but she's kept it warm." The third brother had not moved from the porch. Roe Calloway was 25 and had the look of a man who had made a preliminary decision and was waiting for evidence to either confirm or refute it. His arms were crossed. His eyes, a clear, sharp green, were moving over Clara with the attention of someone who reads people the way she read numbers, looking for the place where the surface and the substance diverge. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His silence was a complete sentence. A woman emerged from the house, then moving with the efficiency of someone who has never in her life wasted emotion. Agnes Drummond, 60 years old, silver-haired, her posture as straight as a rifle barrel. She had been a field nurse in the years before she came to work for the Calloway family, and she had brought that profession's particular relationship with chaos to the task of managing a household of 3 men on 15,000 acres. She looked at Clara the way she had probably looked at new situations all her life, as problems to be assessed and addressed. "Did you ever work a ranch before?" she asked. No preamble. "No," Clara said. "Know how to ride? Well enough not to fall." Agnes nodded. "Honest? Good. Come inside." The house was large and built to last, which was the first thing Clara noticed about it. Not built to impress, but built to endure. Heavy timber, framing, solid stone foundation, the kind of construction that said the man who ordered it did not plan to leave. The furniture was expensive in the way that practical things are expensive, chosen for durability rather than beauty, though some of it managed both. There were no decorative objects for the sake of decoration. Every item in those rooms had a use. On the wall of the main room, a map of the ranch and the surrounding valley marked with notations in 2 colors of ink, red and blue, the territories and decisions of daily operations made visible. It was not art. It was a working document. Clara looked at it for a long moment as Agnes led her through the house. There were no photographs on the walls. Only one framed image in the whole ground floor, at the end of the hallway near the kitchen, a small portrait of a man and woman in formal dress, obviously from some years past. The woman had Eli's eyes. The man had Seth's mouth. They looked like people who had built something together and were proud of it without needing to say so. Her room was small and clean with a window that looked west toward the mountains. On the writing table near the window, someone had placed a candle, a stack of blank paper, and 2 sharpened pencils. Not flowers, not a welcome note. Paper and pencils. Someone had thought about what kind of person was coming and had prepared accordingly. She stood in that room for a moment after Agnes left, looking at those pencils, and felt something she had not expected to feel on her first night in this house, the faint early presence of being understood. She unpacked only what she needed for the night. She placed the wooden box on the writing table beside the pencils. She looked out the window at the dark shapes of the mountains and the stars beginning above them. Then she sat down and wrote the date at the top of the first blank page, followed by 3 names, 1 observation beside each. Eli Calloway. Measured. Watching. Seth Calloway. Warm. Trusting. Possibly to a fault. Roe Calloway. Suspicious. Perceptive. More dangerous than he appears. She closed the notebook and slept. She was dressed and downstairs before Agnes came to wake her. The kitchen was lit and warm already, a fire going and the iron stove coffee on. Agnes turned from the counter and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. which Clara was beginning to understand was a form of approval in this household. Seth arrived first cheerful and immediate, the kind of man who woke up already in conversation with the world. He poured coffee and asked Clara 2 questions about Denver and 3 questions about the journey north, and she answered them with measured pleasantness and used the time to observe the room. Roe came in 10 minutes later. His hair was uncombed, and his expression suggested that mornings were not something he had ever fully forgiven the world for. He looked at Clara standing near the stove, and his eyes went through their quick private assessment, and then he sat down and reached for the coffee pot without a word. Eli was last. He was already fully dressed, already carrying the particular quality of a man who had been thinking since before he woke, who had a list somewhere in his mind and had been reviewing it since dawn. He sat at the head of the table and picked up the document he had apparently left there the night before, a page of notes about the day's work schedule, and began to read. No one initiated general conversation. This table had its own language developed over years of shared mornings, a language of gestures and glances and timed silences that Clara could observe but not yet participate in. She was not troubled by this. She had always learned more from watching than from speaking. The coffee pot on the counter was almost empty. She refilled it without being asked, filled her own cup, and set the pot back and returned to her position near the table. Eli looked up from his notes. He looked at the coffee pot. He looked at Clara. He said nothing. He poured himself a second cup and returned to his notes. Roe across the table had watched all of this. Something in his expression shifted not toward warmth, but away from its opposite. He was recalibrating. Clara could see it. Before he stood to leave, Eli said, still without looking up, "The East workroom. Do not enter it when I'm not present." He rose, folded his schedule into his breast pocket, and walked out. Clara watched the door close behind him. She thought, there is something in that room that matters to him, which means there is something in that room that matters to me. After the men had gone out to the day's work, Agnes handed Clara a piece of paper. It was a list of household supplies needed for the coming month, with quantities noted in a hand that suggested someone accustomed to thinking in bulk. At the bottom, a note: monthly operating funds are logged in the supply ledger second shelf storage room. Calculate the budget for this order. If you truly know accounts, Agnes said, this takes you an hour. Clara looked at the list, then she looked at Agnes. And if I can't, then we'll know where things stand. Agnes turned back to the stove. Clara found the supply ledger on the second shelf, exactly where Agnes had said, a bound notebook, with the year and month marked on the spine in black ink, methodical and consistent, the record of a household run with discipline. She brought it to the kitchen table and sat down with it and a sharpened pencil. She did the requested budget calculation in 40 minutes. She would have been faster, but on page 12 she stopped. An expenditure. $340 marked as agricultural supply western section. She turned back through the pages. Page 7 of the previous month, $340, same description, same vague notation. She turned further. 3 months before that, $340, same words. She sat with the ledger open and looked at the pattern. 3 instances of the same amount with the same ambiguous description at irregular enough intervals that the eye scanning through the book, as one usually scans through accounts, would not catch it. You had to look across time. You had to be looking for the place where the surface and the substance diverged. She took a pencil and a blank page and began to note the dates and amounts. Agnes came to stand beside her after a few minutes, drawn by the quality of Clara's silence, which was apparently a different quality than ordinary silence. "This expenditure," Clara said, and kept her voice level, the voice of someone discussing a factual matter. "Agricultural supply, western section, 343 separate times. Are there receipts?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Eli handles those orders directly." "Are the receipts filed anywhere?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't believe they are." Clara nodded. She wrote 2 more words on her paper. No documentation. Agnes pulled a chair out and sat across from her. This was apparently not something she often did during working hours. "What are you seeing?" "I'm not certain yet," Clara said honestly, "but I'd like to look at more of these ledgers, the ones from previous years, if they're kept." The storage room. Same shelf going back 6 years. 6 years. Clara looked at the ledger in front of her. If this pattern held across 6 years of records, the total would be substantial. Substantial enough to notice if you were looking. Invisible enough to ignore if you were not. She thought of Uncle Henry. She heard his voice as clearly as if he were sitting at the table beside her. They always hide it where the work is most boring. Not in the obvious column, in the one nobody reads twice. She spent the next 2 hours with every ledger on that shelf. She worked systematically, year by year, page by page, building her own separate record on the blank pages she had brought from the writing table in her room. By the time she was finished, she had identified something she had not expected to find on her second day in this house. In 6 years, more than $7,000 had left the accounts of Ironwood Ranch through expenditure lines with no documentation, no receipts, and descriptions vague enough to resist any specific accounting. It came in two forms: the irregular $340 entries that she had first noticed, and a larger annual payment described as water maintenance fees ranging from $800 to $1,200 each autumn paid in cash to an unnamed representative of what the ledger called the County Drainage Company. She sat back from the table and looked at what she had written. $7,000, disappearing with perfect regularity into a company that for reasons she could not yet verify she was not certain existed. Someone was bleeding this ranch dry. Not quickly, not dramatically, carefully, patiently, in amounts small enough individually to pass without examination, large enough collectively to matter. She put her pencil down and looked at the window. Outside in the distance, she could see the figures of men working against the backdrop of the mountains, small with distance but purposeful. One of them was taller than the others. She thought about the cedar oil and fresh ink in Harrington's office. She thought about the altered numeral in the contract. She thought about what he had said to her farmer, the Callaway family goodmen established ranchers. He knew this ranch. He knew its finances well enough to know what to look for and where to find it. And he had sent her here knowing she would be working with these accounts. Or he had sent her here not knowing that she knew how to read them the way she did. That second possibility, she decided, was the more likely one. It was also the one that changed everything. She closed her notebook, stacked the ledgers neatly in their original order, and placed them back on the second shelf. That evening, Seth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee long after supper was cleared, in the comfortable way of a man who has no particular place to be and genuinely enjoys the presence of other people. He talked about Denver the way people who have never been to a city talk about cities, with a blend of curiosity and relief at not being there. He talked about the valley, about neighboring families, about the way the winters came down from the mountains with an efficiency that was almost personal. And then, without any particular transition, without any sense that this information was significant, he mentioned Gerald Harrington. "He's the biggest landholder south of us," Seth said. "Has been for years. He comes through town a few times a month. I run into him sometimes when I'm in for supplies. He's always interested in how things are going up here. Water levels, herd counts, how the season's been." Seth shook his head with affection. "Decent man. He asks after us like he actually wants to know." Clara had been drying a cup near the basin. She set it down carefully. "What do you tell him?" she asked. "What?" Seth looked mildly puzzled. "Just what he asks." This winter was hard herds doing well now, the north streams running lower than usual this dry season. He shrugged. "Nothing special. The north stream, running lower than usual." Clara turned back to the basin and picked up another cup. She kept her voice the same way she kept her face, even unhurried, giving nothing away. "You've spoken with him often." "Oh, a few times. He's easy to talk to." Seth smiled. "Not like some men around here who look at you like you're trespassing just by breathing their air." She nodded as if this were pleasant and unremarkable information. She dried the cup. She said goodnight when Seth finally rose and went upstairs. She stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment after his footsteps faded above her. She thought about what Harrington had said in his office. "We have common interest," he would eventually say, though he had not said it yet. She had understood it in principle. Now she understood it in practice. Seth, with his open heart and his genuine liking for people and his complete absence of suspicion, had been delivering regular intelligence to Gerald Harrington for an unknown period of time. The water levels in the North Stream, the health of the herd, the difficulty of recent seasons, all of it useful to a man who was waiting for the right moment to make a move on a water supply that the entire valley depended on. And she had been sent here to be the next link in that chain, someone closer to the accounts than Seth. someone who could provide more specific financial information delivered naturally in the course of ordinary household interaction without anyone ever needing to ask directly. That was why he had chosen her. That was the common interest, Thornton. She placed the last cup on its hook and picked up her candle from the shelf and walked upstairs. In her room, she opened the wooden box and took out the accounting notebook and added 3 lines beneath what she had already written. Harrington knows this ranch's finances. Someone is extracting money from it. Seth is unknowingly providing information. I was sent here to do the same. She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she wrote below it, he chose the wrong person. 3 days after that conversation, Eli called her into the East workroom. He had spoken to Agnes. Agnes had apparently said enough that he saw the necessity of this, though he had not made the decision easily. Clara could see that in the way he opened the door, not reluctantly exactly, but with the deliberateness of someone moving through a threshold they are not entirely certain about. The room was what she had expected and more. A wide working desk, its surface organized with the same disciplined logic as everything else in this house. On the wall, a large-scale map of Ironwood Ranch's 15,000 acres marked in detail that spoke to years of accumulated knowledge. The pastures, the fence lines, the water features, the elevation changes. And in the corner, a cabinet of dark wood locked with the key Eli kept on his person. He pulled 2 chairs to the desk and opened the main ranch ledger. His bookkeeping was better than she had anticipated. He had taught himself the basics out of necessity when he inherited this operation at 22, with no one to show him how and what he lacked in formal training. He had compensated for with the same methodical intelligence he apparently brought to everything. His numbers were clean, his categories were logical. He kept good records. He just did not keep them the right way. He watched the large picture. He did not watch the details. They sat close enough that she could hear him breathing while she turned pages. It was the closest she had been to him since her arrival, and she was aware of it without being distracted by it. On the page with the water maintenance fees, she stopped. She kept her voice even. This category, water maintenance county drainage, these payments you mentioned, they go to a company representative. He comes out each fall, Eli said, collects directly. Cash. Do you have receipts? Eli paused. It was a short pause, but it was the pause of a man realizing that a thing he had taken for granted is perhaps not as solid as he had assumed. They don't leave receipts. It's a county service. I didn't think to keep documentation. What's the name of the company? He told her. She wrote it down. I'd like to go into town, she said. There's a business registry at the county office. I want to verify some things. Eli looked at her for a moment. This was the look she was becoming familiar with, the look of a man taking the measure of a situation before committing to a response. I'll have Seth take you. She was about to close the ledger when she glanced at the locked cabinet in the corner. She did not mean to linger on it, but she did just for a moment. Eli noticed. He always noticed. 1873, he said. A lawsuit. Harrington tried to purchase water rights to the North Stream through a legal instrument that our attorney argued was fraudulent. We won. His voice was flat and factual. He has not accepted it. He moved to the cabinet and checked the lock, not because he doubted it was locked, but the way a man checks a lock out of long habit. Some fights, he said, still facing the cabinet, do not end when the ruling comes down. He turned back to her then, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there before. Not quite vulnerability, but the shadow of an older wound, the kind that leaves a mark, not because it hasn't healed, but because it was deep enough that the healing itself left a record. She filed that away too. On her 4th night at Ironwood Ranch, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the house settling and the wind moving through the pines on the hillside, sounds that would become familiar in time but were still foreign enough to keep her close to the surface of waking. She was turning the pieces over in her mind, the way she always turned numbers, looking for the pattern, looking for the place where the thing that looked like one thing was actually another. She rose and went to the window. The yard was silver and blue in the moonlight. The barn and the outbuildings were quiet shapes in the middle distance. The mountains behind them were enormous and absolutely still. Then movement at the gate, a rider coming slowly, no torch moving, with the careful quietness of someone who knows the road and does not want to be observed. The horse stopped at the gate. A figure emerged from the shadow near the fence line and moved to meet them. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. Clara could not hear words. She could only see the shapes of two people in conversation, one on horseback, one standing, and she watched them with the absolute stillness of a woman who knows that the most important information usually arrives when no one expects to be seen. The rider left. The figure on the ground watched him go for a moment and then walked back toward the barn in the direction of the kitchen door. As the figure passed through a patch of moonlight, Clara saw his face. Seth. His expression was relaxed and easy, the expression of a man who has just had a pleasant conversation with someone he knows. Nothing furtive, nothing guilty. The face of a person who does not know that what he is doing has any significance. That was the most frightening part. Clara turned from the window and stood in the center of her dark room. She breathed carefully. She organized what she knew. But the rider, the one leaving. As he turned his horse toward the south road, the moonlight had caught him for a single second, enough to illuminate the cut of his coat, the particular gray of it, the style of collar that she had seen once before in a cedar-scented office in Denver. Not Harrington himself, certainly not, but someone dressed in his manner, someone from his house or his organization making a call in the dark hours to a man who would not report it because he did not know it needed reporting. Clara sat at her writing table and lit the candle and opened the notebook. She wrote the time. She wrote what she had seen. She wrote the color of the coat and the direction the rider had come from, and the length of the conversation and the quality of Seth's expression when he returned. Then she wrote one sentence beneath it all: Harrington does not need me to report to him directly. He is already getting what he needs. He sent me here for something else. She stared at that sentence for a long time. She had come to this valley believing she was being used as a passive instrument, a source of household information delivered innocently through ordinary conversation. That was bad enough. But the rider in the night told a different story. Harrington already had his source. Seth had been serving that function for years without knowing it. So what was she for? She turned the question over and over in the lamplight, and by the time the candle had burned a third of the way down, she had the shape of an answer forming at the edges of her thinking. She did not have all of it yet, but she had enough to know that whatever Harrington was planning for this ranch, he was closer to the end of his patience than the beginning. The nightly messenger. The direct approach to Seth in town, the fake debt that had moved Clara herself into position. These were not the actions of a man still waiting. They were the actions of a man beginning to move, which meant she needed to move first. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the page: find the primary ledger. Find the name of whoever is receiving those payments. Find it before he does whatever he is planning to do next. She closed the notebook, blew out the candle, lay down in the dark and listened to the wind in the pines, and thought about her Uncle Henry, who had sat in a bank auditor's chair for 20 years and kept finding the truth even when the truth was something powerful people needed to stay hidden. He had paid a price for that. He had lost his career, his standing, most of his savings. He had gone to his grave in a small house with a kitchen table and a box of tools, and the unshakable certainty that he had done right. She understood him now in a way she had not understood him when he was alive. Outside the window, the mountains held their enormous silence. The ranch lay still in the moonlight, 15,000 acres of land and water and work, 3 brothers sleeping in their rooms above and below her, trusting in the ordinary safety of another night. Clara Whitfield stared at the ceiling and made a promise to herself that she intended to keep. She would find what was being taken from this place. She would find who was taking it. And she would make certain that when the time came to speak, she would have something the courtroom could not ignore. Numbers. Her uncle had given her that. Numbers that could not be argued with, that did not depend on the credibility of a 20-year-old girl from a failing shop in Denver that existed independently of what anyone chose to believe about her. She would gather them one by one until she had enough, and then she would use them. The mountains kept their silence. The ranch kept its sleep, and in a small room with a window facing west, Clara Whitfield lay awake in the dark and counted what she knew. She found Roe before breakfast. He was in the barn already at work in the gray pre-dawn light, moving with the economical efficiency of a man who has spent every morning of his adult life doing physical things before the rest of the world has organized itself. He was checking the tack on one of the working horses when Clara appeared in the barn doorway, and he looked up with the expression he usually wore when he saw her, not hostility exactly, but the active suspension of welcome. She did not ease into it. She had decided on directness the night before, and She held to that decision now. "I saw the rider at the gate last night," she said. "I saw Seth meet him." Roe went still. His hands did not move on the leather strap. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him deciding something. She could see the decision happening behind his eyes, the weighing of one option against another. "You were awake," he said finally. "I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places." He turned back to the tack. He worked for a moment in silence, and she let him because she had learned in her years of watching people that some men need the cover of activity to say difficult things. "That happens every few weeks," he said at last. "Someone from Harrington's operation. Seth doesn't see anything wrong with it. He thinks it's just Harrington keeping track of things in the valley. Neighborly interest. And you," he set the strap down and faced her directly. His green eyes were sharp and assessing in the barn light. "I don't like it. I told him so. More than once." "Does Eli know?" The pause that followed told her everything. "No." Clara nodded. She looked at the horse, which was watching her with the large, calm eyes of an animal accustomed to human difficulty. "Seth is not betraying anyone," she said. "He genuinely doesn't understand what he's doing. That's not a failing of character. It's a failing of information." Roe looked at her as if she had said something slightly unexpected. "Most people would just call it stupidity. Most people are wrong about that distinction." She looked back at him. "Harrington has been using Seth as a source for years. Regular conversations in town, casual questions about water levels, herd counts, how the seasons have been. Seth answers because he thinks it's polite, and he's never imagined that someone would weaponize his politeness." The word weaponize settled into the barn air between them. Roe picked up the leather strap again, then put it down again. "And the money," he said. She looked at him carefully. "What do you know about the money?" "I know the accounts have never quite added up the way they should, given what we bring in every year. I'm not a bookkeeper. I don't have numbers for it. But I know this place, and something has always been sitting wrong." He met her eyes. "I assumed it was just the way of things. Expenses I didn't understand. Fees I wasn't privy to." "It is not the way of things," Clara said. "And I need to go into Sterling Creek to confirm something before I can tell you more than that." "Will you take me?" He studied her for another moment with that sharp, appraising look. Then he said, "Seth was going in Thursday for supplies. I would rather go with you." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but a recalibration of another kind, the adjustment of a man revising a prior estimate. "Thursday," he said. "I'll tell Seth you need fabric, and he can have the trip to himself." She thanked him and left the barn. Behind her, she heard him pick up the leather strap and return to work. She had not expected him to be easy. She had not needed him to be. She had needed him to be honest, and he was. That was enough to start with. The trip into Sterling Creek on Thursday moved through cold morning air that smelled of pine and last season's snow still hiding in the north-facing shadows of the hills. Roe drove and did not make conversation, which suited Clara perfectly. She spent the hour of road time organizing in her mind the specific questions she needed answered and the order in which she needed to answer them. Sterling Creek was not a large town. It had the components a working frontier town required: a general store, a blacksmith, a feed supplier, a small hotel with a saloon attached to church, a school building used for public meetings when the school was not in session, a sheriff's office, and in a narrow two-story building on the east side of the main street, a county records office that appeared to have been staffed by the same man since the town's founding. This man was perhaps 70 thin as winter grass with spectacles that had been repaired at one hinge with a piece of copper wire. He looked up when Clara entered with an expression of genuine surprise, as if visitors were an event he had stopped anticipating some years ago. She asked for the business registration ledger. He produced it from a shelf without comment, a large bound volume that smelled of dust and deliberation. She carried it to the narrow table along the wall and began to read. She was looking for the county drainage company. She was prepared for a number of possibilities: that it existed under a slightly different name, that it had been dissolved and reestablished under different ownership, that it was registered in a neighboring county and merely operated here. She read through every entry from the past 12 years. Agricultural suppliers, mining concerns, merchant operations, transport companies. The valley had more economic activity than she had expected. It was documented with the care of a community that understood the importance of the record. There was no county drainage company. There was no water maintenance company of any description. There was no entity of any kind whose name corresponded to what appeared in the Ironwood Ranch ledgers as a recipient of those annual payments. She checked twice. She was meticulous about checking twice. She returned the volume to the man at the desk and asked a second question, keeping her voice level and interested in the way she had learned made people more forthcoming than direct inquiry. She asked about loan documentation between private parties, specifically about the process for recording a substantial personal loan if a party wanted to establish a legal claim against assets in the event of default. The old man explained the process with the patient thoroughness of someone who rarely gets to explain his expertise. To have legal standing, he said, a private loan agreement needed to be filed with the county recorder. Without that filing, it was essentially a personal agreement between two parties, one that would face serious challenges in any court proceeding, particularly regarding claims against real property. Clara thanked him and walked out into the morning light. She stood on the wooden sidewalk of Sterling Creek's main street and looked at the mountains at the end of the road, enormous and unhurried. Around her, the ordinary commerce of a Thursday morning moved along, men loading supplies, a woman crossing with a basket, two boys running for no reason children need. The loan Gerald Harrington had used to send her north had never been filed. It had no legal standing. Her father did not owe that money. The contract existed only as a piece of paper in a leather folder in a cedar-scented office, and its power was entirely dependent on Arthur Whitfield not knowing that it was worth less than the ink used to write it. And the payments leaving Ironwood Ranch every autumn and at irregular intervals throughout the year were going to a company that did not exist, collected by a representative whose name appeared nowhere in any record in cash that left no trail. She was not dealing with opportunistic dishonesty. She was dealing with a system. A patient, deliberate, long-constructed system designed to drain one operation financially while maintaining plausible deniability and to move a woman into place inside that operation who might be useful for the next phase of whatever was being planned. She found Roe at the edge of town where he had agreed to wait with the wagon. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and it is worse than I thought." He looked at her steadily. He did not ask for details in the street. He helped her up to the wagon seat and turned the horses north, and they drove in silence until the town was behind them and there was nothing on either side but open country. Then he said simply, "Tell me." She told him. She laid it out systematically, the way she would lay out an accounting discrepancy, starting with the observable facts and building toward the conclusion they supported. The fake company receiving payments, the loan that had no legal standing, the pattern of small, consistent extractions over 6 years, the probability that Harrington had been using Seth's friendly conversations as intelligence for years, learning when the ranch was most financially vulnerable, when water was lowest, when the operation was most dependent on outside goodwill. Roe listened without interrupting. When she finished, the road ahead of them was empty in both directions, and the mountains were very close. $7,000, he said finally, at minimum. I have not audited the full accounts. There may be more I have not found. He drove for another minute without speaking, and the woman he sent, meaning you, was supposed to provide financial information from the inside, specific numbers, the kind you can only get from someone who has access to the ledgers. She looked at the road. He did not know I would recognize what I was looking at. Roe turned his head and looked at her directly, the way he rarely looked at anyone without the protective shield of assessment, just a straight, clear look. "What do you need?" "I need to speak with Eli, and I need to go through the full records before I do, so that when I tell him, I am telling him with complete documentation and not a theory." "He'll listen," Roe said. "He doesn't give that easily, but he'll listen." She nodded. She looked at the road ahead and thought about what it meant that Roe Calloway, who had spent her first week in his home deciding whether she was worth paying attention to, had just said those 3 words without qualification. She was not a woman given to sentiment, but she noted the significance of it the way she noted everything significant. She would need allies for what was coming. She was beginning to understand that she had them. The morning Gerald Harrington came to Ironwood Ranch, Clara was in the kitchen garden. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular sound of a well-maintained vehicle on a dry road moving at the pace of someone who is not hurrying because they do not feel the need to. She straightened from the row she had been working and shielded her eyes and watched the wagon come through the gate. Harrington descended with the ease of a man at home on other people's property. He was dressed as she remembered, the gray wool vest, the hat that cost more than most men in this valley earned in a month. He looked first toward the house, and then, with the deliberate casualness of someone who has rehearsed casual, he looked toward the garden, toward her. She did not move. She held the small trowel in her hand and waited. The three brothers had come out to the porch by the time Harrington reached the steps. They received him the way each of them received everything: Eli with a measured stillness that gave away nothing, Seth with an open courtesy that gave away too much, and Roe with the specific quality of attention that he gave to things he did not trust. Clara moved to the edge of the garden where she could hear. Harrington's proposal was elegant in its presentation and transparent in its purpose, though the transparency was only visible to someone who had spent time with the Ledgers. He framed it as a matter of regional benefit. The North Stream, he explained, was a resource the entire valley depended on. Its management under a single coordinated entity would serve everyone's interests at better than the current patchwork arrangement. He was prepared to offer a fair price for the water rights. Eli's response was two words: not interested. Harrington absorbed this without any change in his expression. He nodded slowly, as a reasonable man nods when encountering a position he respects, even if he disagrees with it. He said he understood. He said the offer remained open. He said he hoped they could always count on being good neighbors regardless of any business disagreement. He was turning to go when he passed close enough to Clara standing at the edge of the garden that he could speak without raising his voice. "I hope you are settling in well, Miss Whitfield," he said pleasantly. "We share certain interests, you and I. I trust you are finding the household manageable." He did not wait for a response. He walked to his wagon, settled himself in the seat with the unhurried movements of a man with unlimited time, and drove away. Clara watched the wagon roll through the gate and down the road toward the south. She held the trowel in her hand and did not move until the dust from the wheels had settled. "We share certain interests." There it was, delivered in a neighborly murmur, in a ranch garden, quiet enough that no one else had heard it. An acknowledgement, an assumption. He believed she was still the instrument he had placed here. He believed the arrangement was proceeding as intended. She went back to the kitchen and washed the dirt from her hands and stood at the basin for a moment, looking at the water draining away. She had not yet told Eli everything. She had the documentation she needed from Sterling Creek. She had the 6 years of ledger records she had cross-referenced and organized into a clear accounting of what had been taken and how, and she had the notes she had made about the night rider and the conversations Seth had been having in town. What she had not yet had was the right moment to lay all of it in front of the man who had the most to lose. She decided the right moment was that night. She waited until the house had settled. Agnes had gone to her room. Seth had retired early. Rose, she suspected, was still awake somewhere, but she did not hear him on the stairs. She found Eli in the east workroom, not by plan, but by the line of lamplight under the door. She knocked. He opened the door himself, already dressed for sleep, but clearly not yet ready for it, papers on the desk, suggesting he had been reviewing something. "Clara," he said with a slight adjustment that still happened when he used her name rather than a more formal address. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tonight. All of it." He looked at her for a moment and then stepped back from the door. She sat across the desk from him and laid out everything she had gathered, moving through it in the order she had organized it in her notebooks. She began with the ledger discrepancies. She showed him the pattern of payments to an entity that did not exist, the documentation absent from 6 years of records, the total sum that had been extracted from his operation during that time. She showed him her notes from the Sterling Creek Records Office, the absence of the drainage company from any official registry. She told him about her father's loan, the fraudulent contract, the legal implications of its having never been filed. She told him what Harrington had said to her in the garden. And then she told him about Seth. This was the hardest part. She did not soften it because she owed him the truth without softening, but she was precise about the distinction between what Seth had done and what Seth had intended. Seth had not betrayed his family. Seth had been trusting in the way that decent people are trusting, with the confidence that other people operate from the same good faith that they do themselves. That trust had been exploited by a patient man who had spent years cultivating access to the information he needed. Eli sat across the desk and listened to all of it without speaking. His face did not change in any dramatic way. But something happened behind his eyes that she recognized from her accounting work. The moment when a set of numbers that has been unclear suddenly resolves into a coherent picture, when what looked like randomness becomes a pattern, when the meaning that was always there becomes visible. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known this?" "I found the ledger pattern in my first week," she said. "I confirmed the Sterling Creek records last Thursday. I have known the full picture for 9 days." "Why did you wait?" She answered him directly the only way she answered anything. "Because telling you a theory is not the same as telling you the truth. I needed the documentation complete before I brought it to you. I needed it to be something you could verify independently of my word." He looked at her. She could not entirely read what was in his expression in that moment. It was not anger, it was not relief. It was something more complicated than either the look of a man encountering a quality he was not accustomed to finding in a new context. "The East Cabinet," he said. He rose and went to it and unlocked it with the key from his pocket. He took out a folded document and brought it back to the desk. He spread it open. It was the court record from the 1873 lawsuit, complete with the ruling in the Calloway family's favor and the opposing attorney's notation. Harrington's attorney. He tried this through legal means 3 years ago and lost. Since then, he touched the corner of the document. Since then, there have been small things, a fence line cut, a calf found dead far from where it should have been. Nothing provable, nothing substantial enough to bring to the sheriff. "He has been patient," Clara said. "He has been very patient." Eli folded the document and returned it to the cabinet. "If what you have found in the ledgers is what you believe it is, someone has been collecting those payments on his behalf for 6 years. That means he has had access to this operation's finances through someone inside the county records or banking system for most of the time I have owned this ranch." "Deputy Webb," Clara said. Eli looked at her. "I don't have proof yet," she said, "but the payments are always cash, always collected by the same representative, and the timing of certain decisions that affected this ranch correlates with information that only someone with official access would have. The deputy has been in and out of the county records as is part of his regular duties. He would have had access to your tax filings, your land documentation, your banking records with the county assessor." Eli sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was not a man who showed anger the way most men did with volume or sudden movement. His anger when it came was cold and very still. The anger of someone who keeps it contained because he knows what it can do. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to let me continue gathering documentation. And when I have enough, I need you to trust me to take it to Sheriff Bates in a way that cannot be dismissed or buried." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "You came here in a situation you had no control over, built on a document that was false, and in 3 weeks, you found something that has been hidden for 6 years." He paused. "I am sorry for the circumstances that brought you here." She looked at him steadily. She had been prepared for gratitude or dismissal or skepticism. She had not been prepared for this particular form of directness. "The circumstances brought me somewhere I chose to stay," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man ratifying a compact. He rose and walked to the door and held it open. She gathered her notebooks and passed through, and he extinguished the lamp behind her, and they went to their separate rooms in a house that had just become a different kind of quiet. Roe came back from the north fence line on a Tuesday evening, and the manner of his return was wrong before he was close enough to see clearly. He rode at a walk when he should have been riding at an easy trot, his posture not his usual upright economy, but something angled and careful, the posture of a man managing discomfort without quite being willing to acknowledge it. He came through the barn door and dismounted slowly, handing the reins to the young hand, who came forward, and then he walked into the lamplight of the stable, and his face told the full story that his manner had been trying to conceal. A bruise along his left temple, the color of new iron, dark and spreading. His lower lip split and swollen. A tear in the shoulder of his shirt that matched the stiffness in the way he held that side. Seth was there before Clara, and she heard him draw a sharp breath. Eli, who had been at the other end of the barn, came around the partition and went immediately still. Rose sat down on a hay bale because staying upright was apparently costing him more than he wanted to spend. 2 men, he said. His voice was even, and that evenness was itself a measure of the effort required to maintain it. At the bend past the North Stream, they knew I'd be coming that way. They knew the time. He looked at Eli. They didn't take anything. They weren't trying to rob me. He paused. They said to tell the eldest brother that it was time to sign the papers. The barn was very quiet. The horses moved in their stalls with the small sounds of large animals in close spaces. Outside, the evening wind was pushing through the pines on the hill. Eli stood with the quality of stillness that Clara had learned to recognize as his most serious mode. It was the stillness of a man who is not suppressing emotion, but directing it, gathering it into something purposeful and cold. Seth had gone pale. He was looking at Roe with the expression of someone beginning to understand something they would have preferred not to understand. Clara went to the back of the barn where Agnes kept a medical box and brought it back without being asked. She set it on the bale beside Roe and opened it. She did not speak. She handed him a clean cloth and the bottle of antiseptic and let him work because Roe was not the kind of man who accepted help with his own body from someone he was not yet certain of, and this was not the moment to press that. He took the cloth. He met her eyes briefly. He did not say thank you, but he did not need to. Eli had not moved. Roe looked at his oldest brother and said quietly, "They're done waiting." "I know," Eli said. Clara looked at Roe, then at Eli and said, still, quietly still, in the register of a person addressing a practical situation. "They knew your schedule. They knew the road and the time." She let that settle for a moment. Someone told them. The same someone who had been providing that information for years in the relaxed, cheerful, entirely innocent context of weekly conversations in a general store in Sterling Creek. Seth understood. She could see it happening on his face, the comprehension arriving not all at once, but in successive waves, each one leaving him more diminished than the last. He did not say anything. He sat down on the bench along the barn wall and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. Eli looked at Seth for a long moment. There was nothing punishing in his expression. There was something older and more complicated than punishment. The look of a brother who has watched someone he loves be used without their knowledge and is deciding how to carry the knowledge of it. He looked at Clara. "Tonight," he said, "after supper." She nodded. That night around the kitchen table with Agnes's lamp burning at the center, Clara laid out the complete picture for all three of them. She had prepared for this differently than she had prepared for her conversation with Eli alone. With Eli, she had needed precision and documentation. With all three brothers, she needed something else. She needed them to understand not just what had been done, but how it had been done, and why the how mattered as much as the what. She explained the mechanism of the fraud with the patience and clarity she would have brought to explaining an accounting principle. The payments to a non-existent company, the conduit through the deputy's access to official records. The way Seth's conversations in town had provided a real-time picture of the ranch's vulnerabilities that no amount of distant observation could have produced, and the way she herself had been positioned here to deepen that information access. She was careful with how she framed Seth's role. She said it twice in different words that what had happened was not Seth's failure, but Harrington's design. That Harrington had sought out the most trusting person in the household because trust is the most efficient tool there is when you can find someone honest enough to use it against. Seth across the table from her was very still. He had been still since the barn. She could see him working through it the way honest people work through things they do not want to be true, carefully from every angle, hoping to find the place where it turns out to be different than it looks. But the numbers did not lie. They never did. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know that," Clara said. "I told him about the stream. I told him we'd had a hard winter last year." He stopped. He asked about Eli's schedule once, whether Eli rode the North Line on a regular day. His voice was very quiet now. "I told him it was usually Tuesday." The silence that followed was not an accusatory silence. It was the silence of a fact being absorbed by people who understood what it meant. Roe, who had been listening from the end of the table, spoke without looking at Seth. "You didn't know what you were doing," he said. "Now you do." He looked up. "That's the only thing that matters now." Seth looked at his youngest brother for a moment. He nodded. Something in his posture changed, some internal arrangement, settling into a new configuration, heavier and more deliberate than before. Eli at the head of the table had his hands flat on the surface in front of him. He looked at Clara. The documentation you have. Is it enough for Bates? It is enough to request an examination of Harrington's financial records through official channels, she said, which is what I need. I cannot compel anyone to open that door. The sheriff can. She paused. But I need to see what is inside the door before the hearing. What I have gives us a pattern and an argument. What is in Harrington's private records would give us proof. Rowe looked at her with the sharp attention she had come to recognize as his form of engagement. His office, he said, in town. His office, she confirmed. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Rowe said, Thursday. Harrington has a Commerce Board meeting. Agnes knows the schedule. Agnes, who had been sitting at the far end of the table in her characteristic way, present and attending without imposing, confirmed this without being asked. 3 hours, she said. Minimum. It always runs long. She looked at Clara. My son works as a laborer in that building. I will ask him to leave the upstairs door off the latch for 15 minutes. He is a good boy. He will do it if I ask him. He will not ask me why. Everyone at the table looked at Agnes. She looked back at them with the expression of a woman who has managed difficult situations for 60 years and has organized this one as she would organize any other as a problem with a solution requiring only the correct allocation of available resources. I don't want him involved in any risk, Clara said. He will not be, Agnes said. He will leave. He will buy tobacco at the general store. He will return in 20 minutes. He will know nothing except that his mother asked him to leave the door open. Clara looked at the woman for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that Agnes had been sitting at the far end of that table all this time, taking in everything, saying nothing, and had then produced this plan as if she had been waiting for the right moment to contribute it. She thought about the phrase good people and what it actually required to be one, and how the requirement was usually larger and more specific than people assumed until they were inside a moment that tested it. Thank you, Clara said. Agnes made a small sound that was not quite a response and rose to clear the remaining cups from the table. The meeting, as far as she was concerned, had concluded. They went over the logistics quietly, the four of them, without the quality of drama in the practical way of people planning something that needed to be done right rather than heroically. Seth would go into Sterling Creek as usual for supplies, his presence in town its own form of camouflage. Rowe would wait with 2 horses on the south road out of sight of the main street. Clara would have 15 minutes in Harrington's office, which was more than she would need if she found what she was looking for, and barely enough if she did not. Eli said before they separated for the night, I want you to understand that if this goes wrong, I will tell Bates that you were acting on information I gave you, that the decision was mine. Clara looked at him. It was my decision, she said. It will remain my decision. He held her gaze for a moment. In the lamplight, the quality of his expression was the same one she had seen in the East workroom the night she had told him everything complicated and not entirely readable. The expression of a man encountering something that does not fit his existing categories and is trying to decide where to place it. He said, be careful. I intend to be thorough, she said. That usually amounts to the same thing. She went upstairs and sat at the writing table for a long time after the house had gone quiet, going through the plan again, not because she was uncertain of it, but because thoroughness was a practice and not an instinct, something that required repetition to remain reliable. She listed what she needed to find: the secondary ledger, documentation of payment flows, any record connecting Deputy Webb to the money extracted from Ironwood Ranch, and anything related to Matthew Cole, the territorial inspector from Denver, who had come to investigate Harrington's financial practices in 1875, and who had not, as far as anyone could officially determine, completed his report before his death from what had been recorded as a riding accident. She did not know what she would find in that office. She knew what she needed. The gap between those two things was where the risk lived. She was not unacquainted with risk. She had been brought to this valley under a false pretense to serve a purpose she had never agreed to. She had been placed in a household like a piece in a game she had not been told the rules of. She had spent 3 weeks learning the rules, identifying the players, and making her own decisions about what the game was for. Uncle Henry had done this for 20 years inside the formal structure of an institution, finding the truth in columns of numbers and then telling that truth regardless of who preferred it, stay hidden. He had paid a price for it. He had never regretted it. She was certain of this because she had known him And a man who regrets a price has a different quality about him than a man who has accepted it. She opened the notebook and wrote at the top of the new page, "What I am looking for." She listed 5 items with specificity. Then she wrote, "What I will do if I find it." She listed 3 steps in order. Then she closed the notebook and set it on top of the wooden box where it would be ready in the morning, and she went to bed and she slept. She slept because she had planned as thoroughly as she could, and sleeping was what came next. The ranch was quiet around her, 15,000 acres of worked land and mountain water, and 10 years of 3 brothers' labor holding its shape in the dark. Whatever was coming, it had not arrived yet. Tomorrow it would arrive. She was ready for it. The morning was clear and cold. Rose saddled the horses before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and Seth drove his supply wagon down the main road toward Sterling Creek, 20 minutes ahead of them. Clara sat beside Roe on the seat of the smaller wagon, the wooden box with its accounting tools at her feet, her notebook open on her lap to the list she had made the night before. She read through it once. She closed the notebook. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. Neither she nor Rose spoke for most of the journey. There was a quality to the silence between them that had changed since their early conversations in the barn. It had moved from mutual wariness to something more like mutual respect, which in Clara's experience was the more durable of the two. They came into Sterling Creek from the North Road, and Roe took the wagon to the livery at the edge of town where he would wait with the horses saddled ready to move. He did not wish her luck. He gave her a look that communicated in the specific idiom of Roe Calloway that he believed she was capable of what she was about to do. This was she had come to understand the highest form of encouragement he offered. She walked down the main street of Sterling Creek on a Thursday morning in May, with the sun coming in sideways and warm, and the ordinary world doing its ordinary business around her. She turned at the building that held Harrington's office and went through the ground floor door and up the staircase without hesitating, because hesitation in the middle of a public space is the thing that draws attention. The door to the second floor office was unlocked exactly as Agnes had arranged. Inside the office had the same souter oil smell she remembered from Denver, same deliberate order, same painting of mountain elk above the mantel. She did not pause to observe. She went directly to the filing cabinet in the corner, the bottom drawer first, because that was where she would have stored things she wanted to be less immediately accessible. She found it in the back of the bottom drawer, behind a set of land survey documents that were exactly the kind of files you put in front of things you do not want found. A leather portfolio, dark brown, unmarked. She lifted it out and carried it to the desk and opened it. Inside, a handwritten ledger smaller than a standard account book filled with columns of figures in a neat practiced hand. She recognized the format immediately. This was a secondary set of records parallel to whatever official books Harrington maintained documenting transactions that would not appear anywhere public. She found the Calloway entries in the 4th section. Every payment, every date, every amount, and beside each entry in the payment column initials, F.W. Frank Webb. She did not stop. She noted the page numbers, the dates, the amounts, the initials, and moved forward through the portfolio. Behind the ledger, a collection of correspondence, none of it signed with Harrington's name, but all of it in the same neat hand as the ledger. And behind the correspondence, a separate sealed envelope thicker than the others. Inside the envelope, a manuscript in a different hand entirely. 37 handwritten pages densely filled. At the top of the first page, a heading in careful capitals, Preliminary Findings Inquiry, H.L.N.L. Cole. M. Territorial Inspector, September 1875. Matthew Cole's unfinished report. She read the first 3 pages quickly, absorbing the essential structure. Cole had been investigating Harrington's financial operations at the request of the territorial government following a complaint from a smaller landowner who had identified irregularities in the county water fee assessment process. He had been building a case. He had been close to completion. The report stopped abruptly on page 37 in the middle of a sentence about banking documentation, as if the writer had been interrupted and never returned. Cole had been dead within 2 weeks of the page's date. She could not take the original documents. Taking them would alert Harrington immediately. She did what her uncle had always done. She produced her notebook and her fine tip and pen, and she wrote fast and precise the key data points, dates, amounts, initials, the page numbers, and section headings of the Cole report, the specific language of his preliminary conclusions. She worked with the efficiency of years of practice. The information she captured was not the document, but it was enough to direct a person with legal authority to the document's exact location. 11 minutes. She replaced everything in the portfolio exactly as she had found it. She returned the portfolio to the back of the bottom drawer behind the survey documents. She straightened the papers on the surface of the desk where she had inadvertently shifted them. She put her notebook inside her coat. She walked to the door, opened it, stepped into the hallway, and walked directly into Gerald Harrington. He was coming up the stairs with the unhurried confidence of a man returning to his own domain, his hat in his hand and a folder of papers under his arm. The Commerce Board meeting had run short. They were 2 feet apart. She could see his face change in the fraction of a second as he absorbed the situation's surprise, calculation, and then a settling into the manner he wore like a second garment, pleasant and controlled. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was even. What an unexpected thing. She did not step back. She did not change her expression. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I was looking for the county land records office. Someone in the street told me it was on this floor. I don't think this is right." She framed it as a question, the mild embarrassment of a woman who has made a simple navigational error. She watched him deciding how much he believed this, and she watched him decide to accept it because the alternative was an accusation he could not yet support. "The records office is across the street," he said pleasantly. "Ground floor." "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry to have disturbed your building." She went past him down the stairs, and she kept her pace exactly the same as it had been before she saw him, unhurried, ordinary, the pace of a woman who has nothing to conceal. The street outside was very bright and very loud with the sounds of a morning town going about its work. She walked to the corner, turned south, and kept walking until she reached the livery. Roe was there with the horses. He took one look at her face and said nothing, simply handed her the reins. "He was on the stairs," she said quietly. "Did he stop you?" "No, I was already out." She mounted. "But he will be wondering. We don't have as much time as I thought." Roe turned his horse south. "Then we move tonight." She thought of the notebooks in her coat, the precise records of what she had found, the dates and amounts and initials and page references, and Cole's interrupted sentence on page 37. "We move tonight," she said. "Oz. I need to speak with Bates before Harrington has time to move anything." They rode out of Sterling Creek at a walk, and then at a trot, and then at a full open run across the valley floor, the mountains enormous on every side, the spring air sharp with pine and cold water, and Clara Whitfield rode with the certainty of a woman who has found what she was looking for and knows exactly what to do with it. Behind them, in a second-floor office on the east side of Sterling Creek's Main Street, Gerald Harrington stood at his window and watched the dust of 2 horses moving north toward the Bitterroot, and the expression on his face for the first time in a very long time was not quite the expression of a patient man. It had not yet occurred to him what was coming. It would. That same night, 5 days before the week ended, 2 men from the county sheriff's office came to Ironwood Ranch at first light. Clara heard the horses in the yard and was already at the window when she saw the badge catch the morning sun. They were not there for a visit. Eli Calloway was accused of the theft of 40 head of cattle from the neighboring Pruitt operation, said to have occurred 3 weeks earlier, witnessed by a single man whose name Clara had never heard, and whose description of the accused fit every tall, dark-haired man in 3 counties. She watched from the upper window as Eli listened to the charge with a face that told her he was not surprised. Not because he had done it, because he had known since the night rider at the gate and the bruises on Roe's face that Harrington was moving. He simply had not known in which direction. Eli spoke quietly to Seth and Roe before he allowed himself to be accompanied to the sheriff's vehicle. She could not hear the words. She could see the steadiness of it, the way he distributed his instructions, and then stood straight and walked forward without the quality of a man being led. Before he got into the vehicle, he turned only once and looked up at the window where Clara stood. It was a brief look. It said several things that neither of them had the language yet to say. Then he turned back and got in. The vehicle moved down the road. She stood at the window for another 30 seconds. Then she turned away and went to the writing table and opened the wooden box and took out every notebook she had filled since her arrival. The hearing was 10 days away. She had everything she needed. She had a clear picture, careful documentation, and a set of numbers that could not be argued with. She had names and dates and amounts and a dead inspector's unfinished report sitting in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet on the east side of Sterling Creek's main street. She had 10 days. She put the notebooks in order on the desk and sat down and went to work. Word count for Part 2, approximately 7,200 words. Running total, approximately 14,200 words. Based on the outline, Part 3 requires approximately 5,900 to 6,800 words to complete the full story within the 20,000 to 22,000 word target. The remaining content covers the planning session with Seth and Roe, the visit to Eli in the jail, the preparation of full documentation with Bates, the courtroom hearing the aftermath and resolution of each character's arc, the scene at the North Stream between Eli and Clara, Arthur Whitfield's visit, and the 5-year epilogue. Estimated remaining 6,500 to 7,000 words needed. She did not sleep that night, not from fear. Fear was a thing that happened when you had no plan, and Clara Whitfield had always had a plan. She did not sleep because the plan required revision in light of new circumstances, and revision required wakefulness in the particular quality of attention that comes only when the house is quiet and the lamp is low, and there is nothing between you and the work but the work itself. She spread the notebooks across the writing table in the order she had assembled them. 6 weeks of documentation, the ledger patterns from the first week cross-referenced against 6 years of prior records, the Sterling Creek Business Registry findings, the notes from Harrington's secondary ledger, precise and complete page references and all, the initials beside each Callaway payment, F. W. Frank Webb, the summary of Matthew Cole's unfinished report, 37 pages of careful territorial inquiry that had stopped mid-sentence in September of 1875 and never resumed. She organized it into a single coherent sequence, the way you organize a complicated set of accounts before presenting them to someone who needs to understand not just the numbers, but the story the numbers tell. A good accounting presentation does not merely show what happened. It shows how one thing led to another, how the pattern was constructed, and where the construction reveals intention. By 3 in the morning, she had it arranged to her satisfaction. She made a clean copy of the summary in her best hand, the hand Uncle Henry had always said was the clearest he had encountered in 30 years of working with documents. She wrote it as if she were writing for someone who had never seen any of this before, someone intelligent and fair-minded who would need to understand it quickly and completely. She wrote it for Sheriff Calhoun Bates. At 4 in the morning, she put the pen down and looked at what she had produced. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of documentation that did not ask to be believed. It simply existed, clear and ordered and irrefutable, the way good accounting always exists, not as an argument, but as a record. She thought of Eli in the county jail, sitting in the particular stillness she had come to recognize as his most serious mode, waiting, with the patience of a man who understood that some things could not be hurried, and that the correct response to waiting was to use the time well. She thought of what he had said to her before he allowed himself to be accompanied to the vehicle. She had not heard the words from the window, but she had seen the look he gave her before he turned away, that single upward glance at the window where she stood. It had said something. She did not yet have a word for something that lived in the space between trust and gratitude, and something older and more fundamental than either. She closed the summary notebook and placed it on top of the stack. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark ranch, the shapes of the outbuildings against the mountain sky, the silver thread of the North Stream, just visible in the moonlight at the far edge of the eastern pasture. She thought about what Eli had told her in the east workroom, about his father choosing this land because of that stream, about the 15,000 acres built around a source of water that ran clean and constant through every season. About 11 years of one man's work accumulating around that central fact, the herd and the fences and the men and the equipment and the careful, methodical expansion of something that had started as almost nothing. She was beginning to understand something about the nature of what she had walked into. She had come here believing she was walking into an arrangement, a transaction, a situation to be managed and, if possible, corrected. She was beginning to understand that she had walked into something larger than that, something that had been under construction for a decade and would continue under construction for decades more, if it was allowed to continue at all. She turned from the window and went to bed. She had 4 hours before the house would wake, and she intended to use them. She was dressed and at the kitchen table with the full stack of notebooks when Roe came downstairs at 5. He looked at the notebooks and then at her and said nothing, which was his way of asking. "I need to see Bates today," she said, "and I need to see Eli first." He poured his coffee. He sat across from her. He looked at the stack of notebooks the way he looked at everything that required a decision directly and without evasion. "Seth will want to come." "I know. And he should." She looked at him. He was right, and she had known he was right since the night before, but she had been uncertain whether Roe would see it that way, whether the anger he had been carrying since Eli's arrest would have narrowed his thinking in the direction of exclusion rather than inclusion. It had not. That told her something about Roe Calloway, that she filed away with the same care she filed everything. "Yes," she said, "he should." Seth came downstairs 20 minutes later and found them already in the early stages of the conversation. He sat down at the table and listened without interrupting, which was not something that came naturally to him, but which he managed, she thought, with a degree of effort that constituted its own form of respect for the gravity of the situation. When she had walked them through the full plan, he said quietly, "I want to be the one to tell Bates about the conversations. In town. What I said." He looked at his hands. "He should hear it from me, not from a notebook." She had not suggested this. She had planned to include Seth's account in her summary to Bates, delivered by her in the careful, organized way she delivered all information. But she looked at Seth and understood that what he was asking for was not logistical. It was the particular kind of accounting that is not done in numbers. "Yeah," she said again. "That's right." Agnes came in during the final portion of their discussion and listened from her position at the stove without joining the conversation. When they had finished and the three of them sat in the particular silence of people who have said everything that needs to be said and are now simply being resonant with the weight of it, Agnes set 3 cups of fresh coffee on the table and said without preamble, "Calhoun Bates is a fair man. He has been in an unfair position for a long time. Give him the means to do the right thing, and he will do it." She returned to the stove. "That is all I know about him, and it is enough." They drove into Sterling Creek before the morning was an hour old. The county jail was a stone building on the north side of town, solid and deliberate as everything in this valley that was built to last. Sheriff Bates met them at the door with the expression of a man who has been awake for most of the night and has spent the hours of wakefulness arriving at difficult conclusions. He allowed Clara and Roe to see Eli for 20 minutes. Seth remained in the outer office with Bates, which was by arrangement because the conversation Seth needed to have with the sheriff was the kind that required privacy. The visiting room was small. There was a table and 2 chairs and a window too high to see through. Eli was already seated when they came in, dressed in his own clothes because the charge was recent and the formalities had not yet progressed to the stage that would change that. He looked at Clara and then at Roe, and his expression did not change dramatically, but something in it eased in the way that a structure under tension eases when a supporting element is confirmed. "You found it," he said to Clara. It was not a question. "I found enough," she said. "Secondary ledger with the Calloway payments, Webb's initials on every entry, and Cole's report from 1875. I have page reference and amounts. Bates can get a search warrant on the basis of what I document." Eli nodded. He looked at Roe. "The ranch." "Running," Roe said. "Henderson's got the men organized. Herd's in the east pasture. North fence is holding." He paused. "Agnes is managing the house." Eli nodded again. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at Clara. There was something deliberate in the way he was looking at her, the quality of a man choosing to say something he might otherwise have left unsaid. "When this is over," he said, "I want to have a different conversation. About what comes next." He paused. "If you're willing." She looked at him across the table. She thought about the pencils on the writing table in her room on her first night and the map on the wall of the main room. That was a working document rather than decoration, and the way he had said her name the first time he used it without the formal address, with a slight adjustment that said he was aware it was a threshold being crossed. "When this is over," she said, "I will be willing." Roe, from his position by the door, said nothing, but she saw in the peripheral awareness she had developed for the movements of this household the smallest possible alteration in his expression. Not a smile. Something prior to a smile, the thing that happens in the face before the face decides whether to smile. They left Eli and went to find Bates. The sheriff was at his desk. Seth was in the chair across from him. and the quality of the air between the two men told Clara that Seth had said what he had come to say, and that Bates had heard it in the spirit it was offered. Seth looked for the first time since the night of the kitchen table conversation like a man who had put a weight down rather than a man who had picked one up. Clara sat across from Bates and placed the summary notebook on his desk. She did not hand it to him immediately. She spoke first because a document without context is just paper, and Bates needed the context to understand what he was being handed. She told him the story in the order that made it most comprehensible. She began not with the fraud, but with the purpose behind the fraud, because understanding purpose is what allows a person to evaluate evidence correctly. Harrington's goal was the water rights to the North Stream. His method was financial attrition, over time combined with intelligence gathering through Seth's conversations, combined with a positioned operative inside the household who was supposed to deepen that intelligence access. His execution relied on a corrupted deputy to move money through unofficial channels and to provide access to official records that gave him early warning of any legal or financial changes in the Callaway operation. She then laid out the documentation. She was precise and unhurried the way her uncle had always been precise and unhurried, because precision is what separates evidence from allegation, and unhurried presentation is what allows a careful listener to follow. Bates listened with the full attention of a man who is professionally accustomed to incomplete stories and is now receiving, perhaps for the first time in a long while, a complete one. He did not interrupt. He made notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket. When she placed the summary notebook on the desk and opened it to the first page and turned it toward him, he leaned forward and read. He read for a long time. When he looked up, his face had the quality of a man who has confirmed something he feared was true. "Webb," he said. "His initials appear on every payment entry," Clara said. "The notation is FW and consistent across 3 years of the secondary ledger." Bates was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cole, the report is incomplete, 37 pages stopping mid-sentence. It documents his preliminary findings against Harrington's financial practices, specifically the water fee assessment mechanism that has been used to extract money from Ironwood Ranch." She paused. "He died 2 weeks after the last dated page of that report." Bates put his pen down. He looked at the window for a moment, then at Clara, then at Seth and Roe in turn. He was assembling something internally, the way careful men assemble decisions from the available materials in the correct order. "I can get a warrant by this afternoon," he said. "Judge Alderman owes me a straight-out answer on a legal question, and I intend to collect it today." He closed his own notebook. "I'm going to need the exact location of those documents in Harrington's office." Clara told him. Page references, drawer position, the survey documents in front of the portfolio, the envelope at the back. Bates stood. "The hearing is in 9 days," he said. "I will have retrieved those documents within 48 hours. Whether we can have this fully assembled for the hearing is a matter of what the documents show when we have the originals in hand." He looked at Clara steadily. "What you have given me is enough to justify the warrant. What I find when the warrant is executed will determine the rest." "It will be enough," Clara said. "The secondary ledger alone is sufficient to establish the payment pattern. The Cole report will establish prior knowledge and motive. Together they are not a theory. They are a record." Bates looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate. "Who taught you this?" "My uncle," she said. "He was a bank auditor for 20 years. Bates picked up his hat from the desk. "Your uncle," he said, "did good work." He walked out. They heard him speaking to his deputy in the outer room. Not Webb, the other one, the younger man who had joined the office 6 months ago from a family in the northern part of the county, and who, as far as anyone could determine, had no prior relationship with Gerald Harrington. They rode back to Ironwood Ranch in the morning sun, the three of them, and the ride was different from any previous ride Clara had taken in this valley. She could not have said precisely how it was different. It had something to do with the quality of the silence, which was no longer the silence of people managing uncertainty, but the silence of people who have done what they could do and are now in the interval between action and outcome, which is its own distinct territory with its own distinct feeling. The 9 days that followed were the longest Clara had spent since her mother's death. She worked. She had always worked in difficult intervals because work was the thing that gave form to time that would otherwise have only weight. She organized the household accounts with the full rigor of a professional audit, documenting every expenditure and receipt in a manner that would withstand any future scrutiny. She rode out with Roe twice to inspect the far fence lines because the ranch did not stop requiring attention because its owner was temporarily absent from it. She sat with Agnes in the evenings and learned the particular history of Ironwood Ranch from the perspective of a woman who had watched it develop from a smaller and more precarious version of itself into what it currently was. Agnes was not a demonstrative woman. She expressed what she felt through what she did, which Clara had come to understand was also a form of articulation, perhaps the most reliable kind. She expressed her opinion of Clara's presence in this household through the regularity with which she included Clara in the decisions that shaped the days, through the way she had begun to say we rather than they when she spoke of the ranch's operation, through the particular quality of attention she paid to Clara's comfort without appearing to pay attention to it at all. On the fifth day, Bates sent word that the warrant had been executed and the documents retrieved. He sent no further detail in the message. He did not need to. The fact of the retrieval was itself the detail that mattered. On the seventh day, Seth rode into Sterling Creek and returned with information that Harrington had retained an attorney from Helena and that the attorney had been in conference with Harrington for most of the previous afternoon. Seth delivered this information with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned recently and at some personal cost to distinguish between information and interpretation, to present the first without imposing the second. Clara noted it, filed it, and continued preparing. On the ninth day, they drove to Sterling Creek for the hearing. The courthouse was the largest building in town, built with the particular ambition of frontier communities that intend to become something permanent and want their public structures to reflect that intention. The courtroom held perhaps 60 people seated. By the time Clara arrived with Seth and Roe and Agnes, it held 70, standing along the back wall. Sterling Creek was a small valley with a long memory. The name Callaway was known in every part of it, associated with the North Stream and the cattle, in 11 years of a ranch built by three brothers from almost nothing. The name Harrington was known differently, associated with the county's economic gravity, with the bank and the land company, in the particular way that money, when concentrated, reshapes the terrain around it without anyone being entirely sure when the reshaping happened. The courtroom was the first place in months where both of those associations were in the same room, visible and unavoidable. Eli sat at the defendant's table with the attorney Roe had engaged from Missoula, a small, methodical man named Greer who had reviewed Clara's documentation overnight and had said with the understatement of his profession that it was thorough. Harrington sat in the gallery with his Helena attorney beside him, and the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the ground under him is less solid than it was. Deputy Webb was not present. He had not been seen in Sterling Creek for 4 days. The prosecution presented its case first. The witness was produced, a man in his 40s, with new clothes and an uncomfortable relationship with direct eye contact. He described seeing a tall, dark-haired man on a black horse moving cattle across the Pruitt boundary on a Tuesday night 3 weeks prior. He was specific about the night. He was less specific about everything else. Attorney Greer cross-examined him with the patient precision of a man who has read a thorough set of notes and knows exactly where the gaps are. Under questioning, the witness acknowledged that he had been positioned at some distance from the action he described. He acknowledged that the night in question had been cloudy. He acknowledged that he had not seen the man's face clearly. He acknowledged finally, and with some difficulty, that he had not personally known Eli Callaway before being asked to identify him, and that his identification had been made from a description provided by someone else. The question of who had provided that description was raised and not answered satisfactorily. Then it was the defense's turn. Attorney Greer called Clara as what he described to the judge as a material witness with financial expertise relevant to the context of the charge. It was an unusual designation, but Judge Alderman, a lean man of 60, with the particular weathering of someone who has spent a career in frontier jurisprudence, allowed it without extensive argument. Clara walked to the front of the courtroom and stood where she was directed to stand and looked at the room full of people who had come to see what happened when a name like Callaway met a name like Harrington in a place where the rules required both sides to show what they had. She showed what she had. She spoke for 20 minutes. She spoke the way she had been taught to speak when presenting financial evidence clearly and in sequence without ornamentation, letting the numbers carry the weight, because numbers, when they are correct, do not require assistance. She described the payment pattern. She described the non-existent company. She described the total extracted from Ironwood Ranch over 6 years and the mechanism by which it had been extracted. She described the secondary ledger recovered by Sheriff Bates under legal warrant and the initials that appeared beside every Callaway payment. She described Matthew Cole's unfinished report and the date of its interruption and the date of Cole's death. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Harrington. She looked at Judge Alderman, and she looked at the room the ordinary people of Sterling Creek who worked the land and ran the shops and sent their children to the schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and she told them what had been happening in their valley for 6 years precisely and without embellishment, because the truth, when it is complete, does not require embellishment. When she finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Harrington's attorney rose and objected to several aspects of the presentation on procedural grounds. Judge Alderman heard the objections with patience and addressed them in turn. The documents recovered under warrant were legally obtained. The witness's expertise had been established. The relevance to the charge was direct, establishing both the broader pattern of conduct against the Callaway operation and the credibility of the specific charge as another instrument of that pattern. Harrington rose from his seat in the gallery. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Harrington sat back down. The expression on his face in that moment was the expression of a man who has spent 20 years constructing a version of events and is watching that construction fail in public piece by piece in a room full of people who will remember what they have witnessed. Judge Alderman looked at the prosecution's table. He looked at the witness who had found something extremely interesting to examine on the floorboards. He looked at the documentation on his own bench which Bates had delivered the previous afternoon. The charge against Eli Callaway, he said, is dismissed for insufficient evidence and material credibility failure. He set his pen down. I am further ordering that a formal inquiry be opened into the financial practices of Harrington Land and Loan to be conducted by the Territorial Inspector's Office in cooperation with this court. Sheriff Bates will coordinate the referral. He struck the bench once with his gavel. The sound in the full room was very clean. The noise that followed was not loud, not quite. It was the sound of 60 people absorbing something large and unexpected and beginning the process of incorporating it into what they understood about their valley and themselves. Clara stepped back from the front of the room. She did not look for a response. She did not need acknowledgement from the room. She had done the work required precisely and completely, and the outcome the work had produced was the outcome that the evidence supported. She looked at Eli. He was already standing. He was looking at her from across the room with the expression she had seen once before in the visiting room of the county jail, complicated and not entirely readable, but no longer containing any of the careful distance he had maintained in his earliest days of knowing her. He moved through the standing, murmuring room toward her, and she moved to meet him. They stopped when they were close enough to speak without being overheard. He said, "It's done." "It's done," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment in the way that had become familiar to her over the past weeks, the long, measuring look that was not assessment anymore but something else, something that had moved through assessment and come out the other side into territory that neither of them had named yet. Then he reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not in the style of a man making a declaration, in the style of a man confirming something that has already been decided quietly and without fanfare between two people who do not require fanfare. She let him. She held his hand in the crowded courtroom of Sterling Creek and thought that this was, of all the things she had done since leaving Denver in April, the one that felt most entirely like a choice. Roe appeared at Eli's shoulder. He looked at their joined hands and then at Clara with his characteristic appraising directness. He said nothing. He turned and walked toward the door, and there was something different in the set of his shoulders, something easier, the posture of a man from whom a long-held tension has been released. Seth was already at the door speaking with 3 different people simultaneously in the way that only Seth could manage, his face bright with the uncomplicated happiness of someone whose brother has just been publicly and definitively cleared. He caught Clara's eye across the room and his expression shifted for a moment into something quieter, something that was trying to say thank you in a register beyond social convention. She nodded. That was enough. The weeks that followed had the quality of a landscape after rain, the same ground, the same sky, but everything washed to a clarity that had not been there before. The inquiry into Harrington's financial practices brought 3 additional investigators from Helena within a fortnight. The secondary ledger proved to be the document that everything else organized itself around. Webb's initials matched against the deputy's known handwriting from official records established his role as the collection intermediary with enough certainty that the investigators used the word conclusive in their preliminary report, which was not a word they used easily. The Cole report, once made available to the Territorial Inspector's Office, reopened a question that had been officially closed for 8 months. The answer to that question was still being assembled when the summer turned and the aspens on the mountain slopes began their annual change. Harrington's assets were frozen pending the investigation. His land operations were suspended. The man himself retained his Helena attorney and said very little in public, which was perhaps the most significant departure from his previous habits. Frank Webb was not found in Sterling Creek. He was found some weeks later in a town 2 territories west under a name that was not his own. What followed was a legal process that moved at the speed of territorial justice, which was not fast, but which in this instance moved in the correct direction. The payments to Ironwood Ranch did not return, but they were no longer leaving either. Clara spent the summer doing what she had come to the valley to do, or rather what she had decided to do once she understood what the valley actually required. She organized the full financial records of Ironwood Ranch into a system that anyone with basic competency could navigate, and annotated them so that the reasoning behind each category was documented for whoever would maintain them in future years. She cross-referenced the prior 6 years of accounts to establish a corrected baseline that removed the fraudulent extractions. She corresponded with a legal firm in Helena about the process for recouping the extracted funds through the ongoing civil proceedings, a process that Greer told her had a reasonable prospect of success given the documentary evidence in hand. She also learned to ride properly, in the opinion of Roe Calloway, who was the only one she would have accepted as an authority on this matter, and who gave instruction in the same mode he gave everything directly, and without softening, but with a precision that revealed beneath the brusqueness a genuine investment in the student's improvement. On a Tuesday evening in early August, when the light had that particular late summer quality of something that knows it is temporary and is spending itself fully on that account, Eli and Clara rode west to the edge of the ranch property, to the place where the North Stream turned south, along the base of the first hill, and the land opened into the widest view the property offered. They stopped their horses on the rise. The valley below them was immense in gold in the evening light. The stream ran clean and silver along the hill's base. In the middle distance, the roof of Ironwood Ranch's main house was just visible, a dark line against the larger landscape. Eli looked at it for a long time before he spoke. "My father stood here the first time he saw this land," he said. "He was passing through on his way somewhere else, and he saw this view and he stopped. He wrote to my mother that he had found the place." He paused. She did not believe in until she saw it herself. Then she did. Clara looked at the valley and thought about what it meant to see a place and know it as the place. She had not had that experience before. She was having something adjacent to it now, standing on a rise above 15,000 acres of land that she had spent 4 months coming to know from the inside through its accounts, in its disputes, in its daily rhythms, and the 3 men whose lives it was organized around. She said, "What did he build first?" "The stream channels," Eli said. "Before the house, before the barn. He said if you get the water right, everything else has somewhere to grow." She thought about that. It was the kind of thing that was both practical advice about ranching and something larger than that, and she suspected his father had known it was both when he said it. Eli turned his horse slightly so that he could look at her directly. He had a way of doing this that she had come to recognize, the deliberate choice to face something rather than to observe it from an angle. He had been doing it with her more and more as the summer progressed. "I told you in the jail that I wanted to have a different conversation when it was over," he said. "It's over now." "It is," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said, "not as an arrangement, not as a continuation of what was set up in Denver, as my own question to you without anything behind it except the question itself." The evening light was very warm on his face. She could see in it the outlines of the man she had first seen on the porch in the dark measuring her from a distance, and the man she had sat with in the East workroom, while the patterns of a 6-year fraud revealed themselves between them and the man whose hand she had taken in the Sterling Creek courtroom without requiring anything more of the moment than the moment itself. "Ask it," she said. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not because the arrangement requires it, because you want to. because this is yours as much as it is mine, or could be in time if that's what you want. She looked at the valley below them, gold and enormous, and entirely unhurried by whatever was being decided on the rise above it. She thought about a small room in Denver and a writing table with a candle and a stack of blank paper. She thought about the wooden box with the brass clasp and the initials pressed into the leather. She thought about what it meant to find the place and how you did not always find it where you expected to find it, and how sometimes it was not a place at all but a particular combination of circumstances and people and work that felt from the inside like something you had always been oriented toward without knowing it. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." He nodded. It was the nod she knew, the nod that ratified something that moved it from the category of proposed to the category of settled. Then he turned his horse back toward the ranch, and she turned hers, and they rode down from the rise together in the last of the evening light. At the kitchen table that night, Agnes set supper on without comment, which was her way of marking ordinary events as worthy of continuation. Seth, who had somehow sensed the quality of the evening, without being told anything specific, was warmer and louder than usual, filling the table with the particular kind of noise that cheerful people make when they are covering for the fact that they are moved by something and do not want to make it more than it should be. Roe, at his end of the table, said nothing through most of supper. Then as they were finishing, he looked at Clara with the direct assessing look she had first received in his wariness and had since learned to read as the form his attention took when he was being most serious. "The accounts," he said, "the system you've built. Will you show me how it works?" She looked at him. This was not a question about accounting. "Yes," she said, "we can start tomorrow if you want." He picked up his coffee cup. "Tomorrow, then?" It was for Roe Calloway a complete sentence in a language she was beginning to speak. Arthur Whitfield came to Ironwood Ranch in the first week of October, when the aspens had turned fully and the mornings carried the advance notice of the coming winter. He arrived on the stage and hired a wagon from the Sterling Creek livery, and Clara met him at the gate in the late afternoon light. He looked older. Not dramatically, but in the way that men look older when they have spent several months with a knowledge they cannot put down. Clara stood at the gate and looked at her father, a decent man who had made a choice he should not have made and had spent the subsequent months understanding what it had cost. She thought about the conversation she'd had with herself in the early weeks at the ranch about what goodness requires and how it is not the same thing as strength, and how the two are sometimes confused by people who have not yet been required to separate them. She did not hold the gate against him. She opened it and said, "Come in, Ba." The word she had used for him since she was small, unchanged by everything that had changed around it. He looked at her when she said it, and the expression on his face was something she chose not to make him account for further. He had accounted for it already. She could see that. Supper that evening had a different quality than usual suppers at Ironwood Ranch. Eli had been told of Arthur's coming and had received the information with the same measured quiet he brought to most information, and had said only that Clara's father was welcome at his table, which was a statement both simple and significant in exactly the proportions that Eli generally aimed for. Arthur sat between Seth and Agnes and found himself within 20 minutes doing what most people did with Seth, across from them talking more easily than he had expected to. Seth asked questions about Denver, about the shop, about the road north, and Arthur answered them, and the act of answering ordinary questions from a genuinely interested person was its own form of restoration for a man who had been living for months with the private weight of a complicated regret. Roe did not engage Arthur directly through the meal, but he passed the bread when Arthur's reach fell short of it, and he refilled the man's coffee without being asked, and these small acts of ordinary hospitality from a man who did not perform hospitality for its own sake communicated something that a formal welcome could not have managed. After supper, Eli sat with Arthur in the main room while Clara cleared with Agnes in the kitchen. She did not listen to what they said. She did not need to. She could hear the quality of the conversation, quiet and substantive, two men discussing practical matters rather than difficult ones, which was the way that men of a certain kind process difficult things through the company of practical ones. Later, when the house had settled and Agnes had gone to her room and the brothers were variously occupied or sleeping, Clara sat on the porch steps with her father in the cool October dark. "You are well here," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The mountains were dark shapes against the sky thick with stars. "Your uncle would have liked this," he said finally. "The work you've done. He would have liked to see it." She thought about Henry Whitfield sitting at his kitchen table in the lamplight with a practiced ledger and a patience she had not understood the full depth of until she had needed it herself. "He did the work," she said. "I only used what he gave me." Arthur shook his head. "He gave you the tools. What you did with them was yours." He looked at her. "I should have trusted you. With the accounts, with the contract, I should have listened." She looked at the mountains for a moment before she answered. "You can listen now," she said. He nodded. He looked at the dark mass of the mountains and the stars above them, and she could see him doing something internal. Something that looked like the recalibration of a man who has been carrying something at the wrong angle for a long time and has finally, in a specific place with a specific person, found the right way to put it down. They sat on the porch steps in the October dark for another hour, saying very little, which was enough. 5 years later, Ironwood Ranch extended across 18,000 acres, having absorbed 2 adjacent properties through purchase, rather than pressure, at prices that Eli had insisted be fair, which in this valley was a phrase that still carried the weight of his name behind it. The North Stream ran clean through all 4 seasons, as it always had. Under the water-sharing agreement that Seth had negotiated with every neighboring operation in the valley, the stream served 12 properties and had not been the subject of a legal dispute in 3 years. Seth was married to a woman from the eastern part of the county, the daughter of a school teacher who had a gift for languages and an inexhaustible interest in the world, and who had told Seth, apparently on their 3rd meeting, that he was the most honest person she had encountered in Montana Territory, and she intended to keep him. They had a son and were expecting a 2nd child by Christmas. Roe remained unmarried and showed no sign of considering the matter a problem. He had taken over management of the herd operations and ran them with an efficiency that even Eli acknowledged was superior to his own approach, in certain respects, which was from Eli an extraordinary acknowledgement. He had also learned the accounting system Clara had built and maintained it with a precision that surprised her every time she reviewed his additions. Arthur Whitfield managed the supply and storage operations from a small house at the eastern edge of the property, which he had built himself with the assistance of 2 ranch hands over the summer of his 2nd year at Ironwood. He drove into Sterling Creek twice a week and knew every person in the county by name, which was partly his nature, and partly Clara suspected the ongoing project of a man who was building a different version of himself from the materials still available to him. Agnes remained at Ironwood Ranch and gave no indication of planning otherwise. She had been offered on 3 separate occasions over 5 years the opportunity to return to her family in the eastern part of the territory and had declined each time with a brevity that communicated the offer did not require consideration. She was 65 years old and moved through the ranch with the same economy of motion she had always moved with. She had begun in the last year to occasionally call Clara by her first name rather than her married name, which from Agnes was a form of intimacy so understated as to be almost invisible. Clara sat in the East workroom on a Tuesday morning in October, the same month that always brought the aspens to their full turn and the mornings to their sharpest edge. The workroom had changed in 5 years. There was a second desk, now smaller than Eli's, positioned at right angles to his, so that the 2 of them could work in the same space and consult each other without either one having to turn entirely around. The map on the wall had been updated 4 times, expanded at its edges, to reflect the increased acreage annotated in 2 different hands. On the shelf beside the desk between the current year's account ledgers, in the territorial correspondence file, sat the wooden box with the brass clasp and the initials HW pressed into the leather. It was not a decorative object. The tools inside it were still in regular use. From the window, she could see a portion of the eastern pasture where Eli was working with 2 of the hands on the autumn rotation of the herd. He had the quality at this distance of a man entirely at home in his landscape, which was what he was. She watched him for a moment before she returned to the ledger open on her desk. It was the quarterly accounts. She had built the system so that any competent person could read it, but she was the one who read it because reading it was what she did, and because the numbers told the story of everything that had been built in this valley over the past 5 years, and she was not willing to stop attending to that story. She found no anomalies. She had not expected to, but you checked because checking was the discipline, Because the truth required maintenance the same way that water channels required maintenance, regular attention to ensure that things ran the way they were supposed to run. She wrote the date at the top of the summary page. She noted the total. She noted the comparison to the same quarter the previous year, and the percentage of increase, which was modest and sustainable, the kind of growth that does not exhaust itself. Then she opened the wooden box and took out the small personal notebook she kept at the bottom, beneath the accounting tools in the place where she had always kept it. She opened it to the last written page. At the top of the page dated to that morning, the ordinary things she was grateful for, a practice she had begun in her first winter at Ironwood Ranch when the mountains had been very white and very close, and she had understood perhaps, for the first time fully, what it meant to be in a place where you intended to remain. She wrote, "The accounts are clean, the water runs. Eli is in the east pasture and will be in for dinner. Agnes made bread this morning." Rowe reviewed the September ledger and found one notation I had made ambiguously and corrected it and left the corrected version on my desk without mentioning it, which is exactly how he would do such a thing. She looked at what she had written for a moment. She thought of Uncle Henry at his kitchen table in the lamplight, the practice ledger between them, his voice patient and precise. "The numbers never lie, Clara. Only the people who write them." She wrote one more line. He was right about that. And sometimes the people are telling the truth. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the box and returned to the quarterly accounts because the morning was not finished, and neither was the work, and the work, as it had always been, was the place where everything real happened. Outside the window, the aspens on the mountain slope were at their full turn, gold against the enormous permanence of the stone above them, burning briefly and completely in the October light. The stream ran north. The ranch held its shape against the sky. And in the east workroom of Ironwood Ranch on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1881, Clara Calloway put her pen to the page and continued the accounting of a life that was in every number that mattered exactly what she had chosen it to be. Word count for Part 3, approximately 6,800 words. Total word count for the complete story, approximately 21,000 words, within the target range of 20,000 to 22,000 words. The story is complete. All outline elements have been addressed: the planning session, the jail visit, the documentation, preparation with Bates, the courthouse hearing, including Clara's testimony, the dismissal of charges, the aftermath of each character, including Harrington Webb, Seth Rowe, and Arthur's scene between Eli and Clara at the North Stream, Arthur Whitfield's visit, in the 5-year epilogue. No remaining sections from the outline are outstanding.